Catholics in the Crescent City, the first 300 years, is presented by the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation and the Willwoods Community. Additional underwriting support provided by the Archdiocese of New Orleans and First Bank and Trust.
Signs of Catholic history in New Orleans are around every corner. The way places are named and images arranged. The culture and customs with roots grounded in faith. While time may have altered the traditions through the centuries, this hand-in-hand history lives on. Those who founded this great city were no Mayflower pilgrims. The settlers of the new capital of Louisiana were French and Spanish and Catholic, all ruled by church and crown.
We live in Orleans Parish, not Orleans County. Our neighbors are St. Bernard, St. Charles. We walk down St. Peter Street. The names, the events, the places of the city, they reflect our long, long Catholic heritage that goes back to the very beginning.
Even before Bienville came, there were missionary priests, both Franciscans and Jesuits, who had come to evangelize here even before the city was founded 300 years ago. So the Catholic Church was here before there was a New Orleans.
When Bienville found his way to this sharp bend in the Mississippi River, the echoes of an abandoned Native American village still lingered. He knew it would be a good spot. It was far enough from the Gulf for protection, and yet close enough for travel and commerce, perfect for the capital of Louisiana. Of course, a missionary came with the French explorer and his crew. A missionary always came alongside.
The missionaries traveled with any of the explorers or any of the people that were settling and the colonists. You always had missionaries that were with them to bring the faith to the people.
They encouraged that influence in the building up of the city. The French settlements, all of them, were very clear about promoting Catholicism. And that was just part and parcel of everything that they were about.
When Bienville was here, the king reminded him that the colony was founded to establish religion, because in those days, every administrator, whether he was a soldier, a government official, or a priest, was to propagate the gospel. And every priest was to help found the colony.
And so, as the civil engineers he brought with him figured out exactly where they wanted to settle, Bienville chose to put the church right in the middle of things.
On that spot, the Catholic Church was designated as the sacred spot 300 years ago. So it's very significant to us. The location on which the cathedral is built goes back to the day that New Orleans was founded.
They built a small place for worship, but it wasn't much, and it was no match for the weather. A hurricane came through in 1722, destroying the little church, along with most of the other structures in town. Replacing it would take a while, so for the next 6 years, the church was wherever they could find to meet, from a storeroom to a barroom. A priest passing through wrote there wasn't much to see.
I have at last arrived in this fair city called La Nouvelle-Orléans. About 100 huts placed here and there, a large store of wood, 1 or 3 houses and a half of a miserable store comprise the town. The humblest village in France can boast better homes.
But you have to remember, the population is not very large. It's just a few people that have come to begin the city of New Orleans. I mean, the city itself only goes to Dauphine Street, and then there's a moat that goes around the city.
They needed the moat to help keep out threats, man and beast.
An area that's surrounded by swamp, that's surrounded by animal life, that's surrounded by bears, wolves. In fact, they have to, at one point, protect and put a fence around the St. Peter's Cemetery because they do have animals that are digging up bodies.
The cemetery, while inside the perimeter moat, was in the back of town area. Although they didn't need a moat in the front of town along the river, they did need something to at least try to keep the Mississippi out of the city. They built a small levee, very small, about 3 feet high. While protecting themselves, the new settlers planned to expand and imagined streets beyond their temporary borders.
And we know from accounts by early French engineers that they were very, very frustrated with the young citizens of New Orleans because they just wanted to build their houses wherever they wanted. Well, the French engineers were all basically from a military environment, and they wanted straight streets, a perfect grid.
By 1727, the first permanent church stood in the center of those grids. This was a strong church and would stand in the middle of the growing colony for the next 60 years. People would gather here for baptisms, marriages, funerals, even burials beneath the church.
You could have been buried in the church, or you would have been buried just outside of the church or in that first cemetery. The records that did survive give us a list from in the beginnings all the way to now to a little over 100 people that are buried in church.
The same year the church was built, a small group of Ursuline nuns sailed from France. A grueling 5-month voyage across the ocean, followed by an exhausting 9-day pirogue trip up the Mississippi River. They'd been asked to come to this wild new world to work in the hospital, but what they really wanted to do was to educate girls.
When they arrived, they were absolutely shocked that some of the young girls had never heard the name God, ever. That was the kind of challenge that they faced when they arrived.
They'd been promised a convent would be waiting for them, but they would have to do the waiting. It was 7 years before they had a place of their own. Still, they got to work right away in temporary quarters.
And so we have, in many ways, in the city of New Orleans, the beginnings of the Catholic school system. It was the first Catholic school into what is now the United States. And also, in some ways, it's the first Catholic charities in our country, because they opened a center, an orphanage, and other services for the poor.
Girls were not traditionally educated because they were not seen as important or vital to the success of the community. People of color, Native Americans, slaves, those were not typically the populations that you would see educated. So the fact that our religious brothers and sisters and priests saw the importance of educating those populations as well is invaluable.
By 1731, the Ursulines were caring for 49 orphans. The French government allowed them 8 cents a day for their care. The sisters were working to shape lives and a community, and they were asking France for a little help.
The people that France is sending over to inhabit the country is not the top echelon of educated, well-behaved people. They're emptying their jail cells. They're, oh gee, we picked you up off the street. You're an orphan. Here you go too. We got to populate the area. Let's just send the dregs of French society. At some point with the Ursulines, they start saying, we need people that are of nice repute to be able to come in, and we need women that, can of marrying age. We need young women that can pass education down and faith down.
Jesuit priests were busy with their own work in the area, concentrating on evangelizing Native Americans. They were funding their efforts by working plantation land just outside the city, growing cotton, indigo, and sugarcane. Centuries later, that land would become the New Orleans Central Business District. To get the work done, Many in this French colony, including the religious and eventually free people of color, used slave labor.
There were priests that owned plantations and slaves. There were religious communities that had slaves. There were free people of color. They too had slaves.
A set of laws sent from France governed the treatment of the enslaved, the Code Noir, the Black Code.
The whole Code Noir gives you everything that has to happen for those that are enslaved. They all have to be baptized. They all have to be freed from work on Sunday. They have to be buried in sacred, consecrated ground if they're Christian. And so there's a whole set of laws that are happening, not only for the colonists, but also for the people of color, that go along, that it's demanded that you have to be Catholic.
Also influenced the rules and teachings of the church. So marriages were honored, different things. People were protected in some ways by the laws, in a way. Many of the slaves were, their families stayed together, whereas other places they were sold and separated all over the place.
While far from their home country, the people of this growing city clung to their French culture. Familiar music from home could be heard even in the church and the Ursuline school and convent. Popular music, often given sacred text.
We know the music that the Ursuline nuns had to instruct their young students included all of the major French and Italian composers of the day.
A hand-copied collection of the Ursulines' music, dated 1736, survived through the centuries.
We know that music was considered to be as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was considered to be one of the 4 essential ingredients of a proper education. And that's an underlying theme throughout all of the 18th century.
In 1752, the Ursuline sisters were able to move into a new sturdy convent, a 2-story structure with lots of windows and doors positioned to take advantage of any breezes. The convent today stands as the oldest building in the Mississippi Valley. The Jesuits were about to move as well, but not of their own volition. A complex combination of politics, the new free-thinking age of enlightenment in France, and economic jealousy led to their ouster. Stripped of their property and religious position, they were recalled to France, and soon the Pope ordered the suppression of the entire Society of Jesus. Change was on the horizon for everyone in the French colony. In the 1760s, thousands of miles away, political intrigue and maneuvering would reach across the ocean to the French colony. In a secret treaty, France gave its Louisiana colony to Spain. The flag and the government in New Orleans would soon change. Feeling abandoned by their home country, the 300 or so French colonists in New Orleans were not happy or welcoming to their new Spanish leaders. In fact, some of the more influential residents openly rebelled and encouraged an uprising. Eventually, the new Spanish governor and his pregnant wife were forced to leave. Spain responded with a second governor, Marshal Alejandro O'Reilly, and a few thousand troops. O'Reilly put the instigators on trial and stood them before a firing squad in the Place d'Armes, the parade ground right in front of the cathedral. It ended the resistance, but not the reluctance. The people kept speaking French, the new government leaders spoke Spanish, and when priests from Spain arrived, the church record switched to Spanish as well.
So now you've got French and Spanish going on, and they're trying to live side by side, even though they've, the French aren't really happy that they're being controlled by Spain.
Some of the new religious leaders were not happy either with what they saw as a more relaxed religious atmosphere.
The first Spanish Capuchins arrived in 1772, and they were absolutely horrified at the customs, the traditions that had developed here. They considered them lax.
Things like putting milk in coffee, priests using nice dishes and actual silverware. The Spanish Capuchins saw this as a flagrant violation of their poverty vow. The Spanish influence was felt in rule and religion. Now a part of the Diocese of Havana, Cuba, and ruled by Spain, new laws governed behavior and morals. Laws against infidelity and blasphemy, speaking against the Lord of the Blessed Virgin Mary, brought harsh and public punishment. Enslaving Native Americans became illegal, and other slaves were given the right to purchase their own freedom. Catholicism was the only permissible religion. It was the Spanish who put the brakes on carriage rides to Good Friday Mass. It was their custom to walk to church, because Jesus had walked to Calvary. So Spanish soldiers were on hand to make sure the French would also walk that day. And because he had seen it happen in other churches, Marshal O'Reilly made a rule that no one could bring their dogs to church. When Father Antonio Sedela arrived from Spain, he brought a complicated mix of religious fervor and rebellion, exasperation and charm, defiance and humility.
Probably the most colorful clergy person that's ever been here. Probably the most controversial. And probably one of the most pastoral.
He consistently aggravated his superiors, but ingratiated himself with the people. They loved him and called him by the French version of his name and title, Père Antoine. He was in charge of the church on a day that changed the face of the growing city of New Orleans. On Good Friday in 1788, a candle set a lace curtain on fire in the private chapel of the military treasurer, about a block away from the church. It quickly grew out of control. History blames Père Antoine for refusing to ring the church bells to alert the people.
We know during Lent there is always time when bells do not ring. There is no music in church during Lent. They use what they call clackers, so they are wooden pieces that make a clacking noise. So you know the hours of the day, you know the time that you need to be saying your daily prayers. So when you're in church, they do the same thing. It's this clacker that they use.
So the bells remained silent that day. The only sound people could hear was the roar of the flames. At first, Père Antoine was trying to save the sacramental records.
He initially took some of the books and put them in the house of one of the government officials. And then as the fire spread, he took the ones that were left and threw them out into Jackson Square. And the ones we have are the ones that were you threw in Jackson Square because the house burned down.
As the wind was coming up and sweeping the city, and as you lost all these buildings, Père Antoine got word that the fire was moving towards the old Ursuline convent, and he ran then to help the Ursulines. So as he arrives here, what's happening on the campus at Ursuline is they've begun to dump buckets of water on the structure and trying desperately to save the building. They put the small sweetheart statue in the window, and the winds change. And this structure, the old Ursuline convent, it's one of the few structures that does not burn.
Most of the rest of the city did burn. Within 5 hours, 80% of it was gone, nearly 900 structures. Père Antoine wrote just a brief note mentioning the all-consuming fire in the margins of a surviving sacramental record book. Homes, businesses, government buildings, and the only church were in ashes. The city and the people needed help rebuilding, and the wealthy philanthropist Don Andrés Almonester showed his generosity. He gave money to rebuild the church, the town hall known as the Cabildo, the presbytere, charity hospital, and a chapel for the Ursulines. He did get a few things in return. Among them, a burial spot was reserved for him in the church. And at his request, the bells would ring every Saturday, forever, to remind people to pray for him. The bells still ring on Saturday. To help the people who had lost their homes, the government cleared some space in the garden behind the church.
We know that the Spaniards in that time divided the garden up and rented lots out to people so they could build little huts there to live, sort of like 18th century FEMA trailers.
As they rebuilt, They soon realized they had to do something about the cemetery. An unpleasant nickname, the city of the wet grave, had obvious origins. In-ground burial in soggy, flooded earth was not working. Water would fill up the ground and the graves. Fear of disease and contagion led to a decision.
St. Peter Cemetery was getting full, but in addition to that, the Spanish government felt it was best to have a cemetery outside of the city limits because of possible diseases they thought could be transmitted to people.
Land on the outskirts of the city was chosen for the new St. Louis Cemetery, and here the custom would change from in-ground to above-ground burials. From small to ornate, the tombs and statuary looked much different than the simple first cemetery. Père Antoine put himself in charge of all funerals there. His ways and attitudes, combined with his disregard for orders, pushed his superiors and the governor to the limit. And then he brought up his plans to bring the Spanish Inquisition to New Orleans.
He told the governor he was the inquisitor. The governor went, whoops, go home. Because, I mean, that sort of, if you were Spanish, the Inquisition was not something you wanted in your back door.
Exiled to Spain, he was allowed to return after a couple of years. And while he kept his often rebellious ways, the people loved him. He even chose to live in one of those huts behind the church.
In our archaeological excavations, in the digs, they were able to find what they think was the structure of the hut and where it may have been. They also found a small crucifix near the hut that actually dates to the time period of Père Antoine. Whether or not this was his or not, we don't know. You know, he lived a very small life. He's a monk, and he lives as a monk. He lives in, a mohair garment.
And once again, he would be in charge of the church, the new church, much larger and more impressive, grand enough to be a cathedral, which would soon prove useful.
Baltimore has become a diocese and becomes a diocese in 1789. And because of that appointment of that diocese, more than likely then, the King of Spain is going, if they're going to have a diocese on North America, I want a diocese in my part of North America, which would have been the entire Louisiana territory. The Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas is the second diocese in all of North America.
No one could imagine it. It went from Key West, Florida, up the East Coast to the bottom of the new American colonies, across the Mississippi, up the west of the Mississippi into Canada, and as far west as anybody knew. Lewis and Clark had not yet explored. No one had any idea how far it was, what was out there, who was out there.
The creation of the diocese meant that when the new St. Louis Church opened its doors, it was blessed as the St. Louis Cathedral. Inside hung a gift from the King of Spain, a large crucifix, and near the front door stood one of the few things they were able to pull from the ashes of the burned church, the baptismal font. Both of these survived the centuries and remain in the cathedral today. It would be another year before the first bishop chosen by the King of Spain would arrive. Luis Penalver Cárdenas, a native of Havana, would spend much of his 6-year tenure trying to improve the moral climate and encourage church participation. He once noted that fewer than 400 of the 11,000 parishioners fulfilled their Easter duty of confession and communion.
According to French and then later Spanish law, you had to be Catholic if you lived in the colony. You couldn't be anything else. Now, administrators had the sense to realize that some of the most productive citizens were possibly not Catholic. They were not about to push them out because they weren't Catholic. These people contributed to the colony, and it would be economically stupid to get rid of them.
Economically, things were looking up. In 1796, a sugarcane grower on the outskirts of town, where Audubon Park is today, revolutionized the process of making granulated sugar. Demand grew rapidly, and so did the New Orleans economy. Even the streets brightened up a bit that year, as 80 street lamps were hung up around town. A $1 a year tax on every chimney helped pay for the oil in the lamplighter. But all of this success did not necessarily spill over into the church. Outside influences were changing the religious climate. Literature and ideas from the French Revolution made their way to the city, along with skepticism toward the clergy and religion itself. When the first bishop left in 1801 to become the Archbishop of Guatemala, Bishop Francisco Porro Reynado was chosen to take his place.
But there's a problem, because Spain knows they've already signed a treaty with France to give the territory back. So they don't want to send the bishop yet, because we're kind of overseas in Europe. They know what's going on. We don't know yet that we're getting ready to change hands multiple times, but there's this time period. So Spain is like, well, we're kind of getting ready to give the territory back. Should we send him as bishop or not?
They decided not to send him. And so the second bishop of this vast diocese never arrived. In fact, it would be another 14 years before a bishop would again sit in the St. Louis Cathedral. And again, change was heading for New Orleans and all of the Louisiana Territory. The stroke of a pen in Europe would write a dramatically different future for the colony and everyone who lived there. At the turn of the century, New Orleans was still relatively small. It stretched a mile along the riverfront and was about 1/3 of a mile wide. But it was a huge pawn in an international chess game, with secret deals and maneuvering for power and money.
Suddenly you have Spain transferring the colony to France, who in turn sells it to the United States. As one historian said, many have said, the greatest real estate deal in the history of the country.
With Thomas Jefferson, when he purchases the Louisiana Purchase, he doesn't want the whole thing. He wants New Orleans. New Orleans being a port city, it is the most important in all of the territory because it controls the river. It controls getting into the North America and into Central North America, and it controls all the shipping. It controls the in and out of goods.
He got the whole territory, but the prize was New Orleans, which, even at the turn of the century, was a small but very cosmopolitan city, boasting 8,000 residents. People from other cultures and countries migrated to this bustling port city with its mix of religion and revelry. And thousands of French-speaking refugees from the Haitian Revolution, white, free people of color, and slaves, would double the population.
In 1800, there were 50 marriages at the cathedral. In 31 of those marriages, 62%, the two spouses were born in different countries. That's pretty astounding, which means the children grow up with two traditions already.
France officially handed New Orleans over to the United States just before Christmas in 1803. The ceremony at the Cabildo was celebrated outside in the Place d'Armes. Now, as part of the United States, more and more people could see the advantages to this city on the Mississippi, so different from the rest of the country.
So we're coming into the United States as foreigners, strange foreigners, brown, Catholic, French, Spanish speakers as well. We're not English-speaking Americans. We speak French. We have free people of color. We have people that are enslaved as well, but we have people that are this mix. They're Catholic.
But in this new country, you didn't have to be Catholic. For its entire existence, New Orleans had been a one-church town, dependent on a Catholic crown for support and government and direction.
Under the French and the Spanish, the government authorized missionaries, purchased land, built churches, paid the salaries of the clergy. One of the questions is, what will be the role of the government in the Catholic Church?
Who would own what? Would the government own the church property and buildings? The Ursuline sisters, who lived a cloistered life in their convent and school, did not waste any time in sending a personal letter to President Thomas Jefferson. His swift reply set their minds at ease about their property and their freedom of faith, assuring them all the protection of his office. So the government would not try to control things. But as it turned out, the threat to the church would actually come from within. As a new territory of the United States, New Orleans soon gained a reputation.
There's reports about the debauchery that's going on during that time because we don't have a bishop that's leading this diocese and teaching people and shepherding people in their faith. And not much has changed sometimes in Louisiana with the debauchery that has happened, but we get this reputation for eating and drinking and being merry and not necessarily being as true to our faith as we should be.
The number of priests dwindled, and there was really no one in control.
Rome is over in Rome, looking at the map and saying, what do we do? So they say, okay, the closest place is Baltimore. So they contacted John Carroll in Baltimore in 1805 and said, you're in charge of Louisiana.
So the church would be governed from afar. 9 years after being bought by the United States, in the spring of 1812, Louisiana became the first state carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. 19 days later, they would also be at war. And very soon, New Orleans would play a pivotal role in defending its new country against an old enemy, England. War kept its distance until in 1814, the British set their sights on New Orleans. Securing the port city would give them control of the Mississippi, and with that, control of the interior of the continent. As one British leader put it, making Americans prisoners in their own country. Major General Andrew Jackson was the American answer to British designs on New Orleans. His first stop was right in front of the St. Louis Cathedral. Speaking through interpreters, his first mission was to get the city on board to fend off a looming British invasion.
Good citizens, you must all rally around me in this emergency, cease all differences and divisions, and unite with me in patriotic resolve to save this city from dishonor and disaster.
The St. Louis Cathedral became the rallying place for prayer and patriotism. Father William Dubourg, the new administrator of the church in New Orleans, knew there was a city full of people who would find comfort in their faith. With full support from General Jackson, he issued a mandate for 3 days of prayer. And Jackson declared martial law in the city, the first time an American general had done that. As the battle drew near, those who could fight left for Chalmette, just a few miles east of the city. The Ursuline nuns closed the school and sent boarding students home to be with their families or friends. And on the night of January 14th, 1815, they opened their doors to the women and children of the city who needed a place to be, a place to pray.
You had 11,000 British soldiers descending on the city or coming up to the city, try to capture the city. So there was a lot of prayer that was going on, both with the Ursulines and I'm sure at the cathedral as well.
All of the city was in grand consternation over the subject of the attack of the English. We placed the statue of Our Lady of Prompt Succor on the altar.
And they prayed, asking for prompt succor, for quick help. The men had turned into soldiers, the women were prayer warriors. Outgunned, outnumbered, but not out. The ragtag American army fought against all odds. Early the next morning, a loud knock on the convent door. The sisters recorded the moment, the miracle, in their private records.
A messenger arrived in the church and announced in a loud voice the defeat of the English. Thus, that grand army, commanded by generals proud of their ability in military art, was cut in pieces.
It was a grisly scene on the battlefield. There were more than 2,000 British casualties. The American casualties were fewer than 20. The convent opened its doors again, this time as a makeshift hospital. Nuns turned nurses as they cared for the injured from both sides. The wounded would fill the convent for months. The victory was a turning point in American history. Winning the Battle of New Orleans secured the Mississippi River, protecting trade and access to the middle of the country while encouraging expansion westward. And the state of Louisiana, only weeks old when the war broke out, gained respect in the growing United States. Even the hardened General Jackson realized this victory was a miracle.
That Andrew Jackson admits himself that he was not a faith-filled person, but when he did win the war, he himself said, "This is an act of God." So even in the most difficult of times of warfare, of disaster, there was a sense of faith that came about.
Jackson asked Father Dubourg to arrange a grand celebration at the cathedral, and the whole city turned out. The Ursuline nuns could hear the festivities from their home a few blocks away. Being a cloistered order, they did not leave their convent. But Jackson made a special stop there to thank the sisters for standing with them throughout the battle.
The Te Deum is sung on January the 8th, and it was sung every year at the cathedral to commemorate the Battle of New Orleans. And it is still sung at the Ursuline Academy, at the National Shrine of Our Lady of Prompt Succor every year on January the 8th.
The victory opened the eyes of the rest of the country to New Orleans. Its population of 33,000 in 1815 would grow to 41,000 in 5 years. Steamboats found their way to the city filled with trade and commerce. There were plans for railroads and paved streets and waterworks. So many changes, and new faces with different faiths. While in the Catholic Church, there was still no bishop to lead. Church attendance declined, and Father Dubourg didn't really like living in New Orleans.
He found it so inhospitable that he went up to St. Louis and spent most of his time there. Then finally, in frustration, in 1815, he went to Rome to beg Rome to appoint a bishop, finally. And Rome said, "That's a great idea. You're the new bishop." You get what you ask for.
So for the first time in 14 years, the diocese had its own bishop who wanted to move.
I can only imagine. It's hot. You know, this isn't, at the time, a great place to live. I mean, we love it, but coming from France, it was just the climate, the heat, the people. He just decided to take up residence in St. Louis.
But before he left for good, he realized the huge need for more religious in the diocese, men and women to uphold and spread the faith. He traveled to Europe, as many other church leaders had done, recruiting priests and nuns. The Society of the Sacred Heart answered his call, and in 1818, Rose Philippine Duchesne and 4 other nuns boarded a ship to the New World. It was a harrowing 10-week voyage. By the time they got to New Orleans, Bishop Dubourg had already left for St. Louis. They stayed with the Ursuline nuns for a while, but then continued their journey to serve in Missouri. Duchesne and her sisters would go on to open convents and several schools, including the Academy of the Sacred Heart in New Orleans. In 1988, Philippine Duchesne was canonized in the Catholic Church. With Dubourg in St. Louis, Père Antoine was in charge, a friend to the poor and needy. Actually, he was able to make a lot of friends outside of clergy.
I think he knew probably half the city of New Orleans personally, because he either baptized their children, married them, or buried their dead.
He had adopted a more relaxed style of religious leadership. He baptized and performed the first marriage ceremony for Marie Laveau, who later became a famous voodoo queen in the city.
There are some really prominent people that are married by him. I mean, that, we think about as the notorious people of New Orleans that pass through the cathedral and that people hear about and people talk about. And he was involved with all of them, and people loved him. People really loved him.
He was often standing next to them in times of sorrow, presiding over funerals, Too often, there were overwhelming numbers of funerals, as frequent contagions and yellow fever epidemics ravaged the population. The city got involved in 1821, making it against the law to place the dead on view during funeral services. Too much exposure, they said. Because New Orleans was still predominantly Catholic, the city council asked the church wardens to build a special chapel for funerals, close to the St. Louis Cemetery. Père Antoine laid the cornerstone along with the mayor and other dignitaries. And a little more than a year and $17,000 later, the mortuary chapel was blessed, and the wardens were in charge.
They also at one point went to the local first municipality and got them to pass the dead corpse ordinance, which said that all the dead could only be buried from the chapel on Rampart Street, the future Our Lady of Guadalupe.
So they would wake the people right there and have the mass in the church, and then just bring them right there across the street and bury them in St. Louis number 1. And then over the years, with the canals being built and the neighborhoods developing and the city coming out more, the cemetery kept getting cut down in size. So now when you walk in the front gate, that was originally the center of the cemetery.
When Père Antoine died in 1829, the church wardens made an exception and had his funeral in the cathedral. In fact, the people's priest, as many called him, was buried beneath the church, and the city mourned.
When he died, the city closed down. I mean, everything closed. All the businesses closed. I think there was something about the government officials wore a black band for like 30 days. He was truly beloved.
Those early years as a part of America were challenging for Catholicism in New Orleans. With all of the growth going on in the city, growth in the church seemed to be stalled. The huge diocese would be reduced in size twice, and only one new parish would be established in the 30 years after the Louisiana Purchase.
Finally, in 1835, a French priest by the name of Antoine Blanc was named the bishop, and Blanc turns everything around. He was a wonderful, wonderful administrator, a very pastoral man, and he was in charge for 25 years, and this is really the growth of Louisiana Catholicism.
You're getting different immigrants that are coming in during that time period. So the French and the Spanish are already here, but the Irish have come in. The Germans have come in. The Irish and the German are going to start outpacing during the 1800s the French and the Spanish immigrants.
The language barrier led to the first new parish outside of the city borders. In 1833, St. Patrick's became the English-speaking answer for Catholics, especially the Irish immigrants who did not speak French. So popular, within a few years they knew they would have to grow. And they did, building a grand cathedral-like building right around the old wooden one. In fact, they kept using the old church during and within the new construction. When finished, they dismantled the old church and took it out piece by piece. The Ursuline nuns donated the land for another church parish outside of the city, St. Augustine Church, would keep the French but mix the races.
One of the oldest black churches wasn't considered a black church, but it was a substantial number of black people in that church from its beginning, was St. Augustine's in Tremé area. It was a mixed parish from its beginnings. Whites, free people of color, and slaves worshiped together.
And what happens is the white people buy up some of the pews, the free people of color buy up the other pews, and the free people of color put up the money for where the enslaved people are going to sit.
St. Augustine played a key role in the life of Henriette de Lille. She had turned from the life of relative ease in the Plaçage system, a well-known cultural custom at the time where young free women of color would live as mistresses to wealthy white men. De Lille, though, felt called by God to live a religious life, and while she was prohibited by racial and religious laws from becoming a nun, she began much of her own ministry at St. Augustine, working with African-American children. The priest at the church, Father Etienne Roussillon, and Bishop Blanc would discreetly support the women along the way, as they helped the elderly, nursed the sick, and defied the law by educating both free people of color and the enslaved.
There were really no black communities of sisters in the area. And she was faith-filled and determined, and it was because of the support of Bishop Blanc that she was able to found the religious community of the Holy Family Sisters. And thank God for his openness, thank God for her perseverance and courage, and we thank God that we have the Holy Family Sisters and have had them for all of these years.
But at the time, because of her race, she would never be allowed to wear a habit. Not recognized as nuns, the Sisters of the Holy Family were listed in the Catholic Directory of the United States as an association of colored persons for the nursing of the sick and the destitute.
As the city begins to grow, and as we start getting neighborhoods, and at that time we call them faubourgs, which were the neighborhoods, so you're watching the immigrant populations that are coming in, and you're watching the expanse.
Even as the population grew and moved outside of the French Quarter, the cathedral was still the center of town. Its image was even featured on a $200 banknote dated 1837, with a few upgrades, a central tower, 3 new bells, and a clock to help the people mark the time. It called the masses, to mass, of course, but also to culture, even wholesome entertainment.
And so you see throughout history, from the 1820s on, that the cathedral served as a wonderful venue simply for concerts. Stop and think of this. Right behind the St. Louis Cathedral, you had one of the great opera houses of the United States, the Orleans Theater. So many of the performers would also sing at the cathedral, but also arias from various operas would be given a sacred text and sung in the cathedral.
To help spread the news about what was going on in the church and in the community, the first Catholic newspaper in New Orleans made its debut in 1842.
It was called Le Propagateur Catholique, 1842, lasted until about 1860, written in very elegant French. There was a lot of Catholic clergy who had come to New Orleans after kind of the anti-clericalism uprising in France, and so they came to New Orleans. And obviously well-educated French priests were very interested in sharing the Catholic faith. People, of course, in those days got information by reading, and newspapers were a big part of how they learned not only about what was going on in civic life, but what was going on in the church.
A subscription to this weekly family newspaper, as it was described, cost about 50 cents a month. The paper wasn't alone in trying to get the word out. With so many new people came new attitudes and ideas and beliefs, and a need for religious reinforcements. And as they had done in the past, sisters, brothers, and priests answered.
It is a mission field. We are not the way we are now as a strong Catholic church. We are a missionary field. They're sending missionaries to us. The whole United States doesn't stop being a mission field until the 1900s.
They nursed the sick, ministered to spiritual needs, and opened schools.
And each religious community came with a different focus and a different charism. The sisters and the religious brothers and priests who came to educate the children saw the importance of the success of the city continuing by forming the future of our city in faith. So building the faith community, educating the hearts and the minds, preparing them for both heaven and for success in the city was, I believe, vital to the success of the city of New Orleans.
There were in those days still some dark influences clouding the church and its mission. The church wardens, locally and in many other dioceses, had overstepped their role and were attempting to rule.
The church wardens, in French, they're known as morguiers. And so, we have this clash that's going to happen between the church and the church wardens, because they want to control who's in the church, who's running the church, how the church is being run. And so there are men saying, well, wait, we don't want that priest here, we don't want that there. So these are men that are controlling the monies and the functions of the church, and at some point actually put a stranglehold on them.
The wardens were a rather cantankerous group and also a bit anti-clerical, probably more than a bit, and probably anti-religious at the same time. Interesting administrators of your cathedral. They withheld the money that they're supposed to provide to assist with the running of the diocese. In 1837, They mortgaged the cathedral for $200,000 without anybody knowing it, the bishop or anyone else.
Later on, they're actually going to close the cathedral because with the church wardens, they control it so much that they don't even want the bishop in the cathedral. And they throw him out. He has to have Mass somewhere else. Now, he said Mass at St. Augustine for a while, at the church there. He also said Mass at St. Patrick's, which had been built in 1833. Where the Irish had built a church and where God spoke English and not French.
The faithful there stood behind their bishop, volunteering to march with him 1,000 strong to take the cathedral back from the usurping wardens.
Finally, in early 1842, they made their big mistake. They appealed to the courts to settle the problem. They decided in favor of Bishop Blanc. Shortly afterwards, they had another election. All the cantankerous wardens were voted out of office.
With the weight of infighting off his shoulders, the bishop turned his attention to improving the church, renovations and remodeling. There had been a plan floating around during the warden years to relocate the cathedral. Instead of renovating, just build a new one where the first St. Louis cemetery was located on Basin Street. They would dig up the remains and put them in vaults in the new church. That was not a popular idea. In the meantime, Baroness Pontalba, Almonester's daughter, owned much of the property around the Place d'Armes and was doing some renovations, a lot of renovations. And she got the city on board to help fund improvements at the presbytery and the cabildo, even the square itself. To keep its prominent stature, the cathedral needed some serious attention. In 1849, plans to expand a bit, add more seats and more height, were already underway. But then things went horribly wrong.
During this whole process of enlarging the church and doing some other renovations, the whole thing kind of collapses in on itself.
The only usable structure left, the foundation and part of the front facade. They would basically have to start from the ground up. St. Patrick's became the co-cathedral during the 2-year rebuild, and actually good news would arrive before the new cathedral was finished. The Pope had named New Orleans an archdiocese. On December 7th, 1851, the cathedral was blessed. Once again, its presence and grandeur commanded the attention of all who saw it. An impressive central bell tower reached above all the other buildings. It featured an ornate open-air design of iron and cypress. They soon covered it with slate to prevent the wind from ringing the bells. A garden in back provided rest and shade, and inside was much roomier. Statues and art graced the walls and corners. There was beauty to see from the marble floor to the fresco-filled grand arched ceiling. There were galleries, and a magnificent high altar was shipped in from Europe, and the 2 side towers would soon be graced with a double-barred cross, symbolic of an archdiocese. The cathedral had grown. The church and its people were looking forward to growth as well, and a faith-filled future of purpose and promise. In 1728, Father Charlevoix, the priest who had just a few years earlier written about the city's scattered huts and a miserable store, made a second stop in New Orleans. This time, he saw beyond the swamps and wilds.
My hopes, I think, are well founded that this wild and desert place, which the reeds and trees still cover, will be one day, and that not far distant, a city of opulence and the metropolis of a rich colony.
It would not be too far into the future that New Orleans did grow up, through changing flags and languages and cultures. Its opulence often reflected in the only church in town, the Catholic Church turned cathedral. Throughout nearly a century and a half, those early settlers and immigrants faithfully gathered, defended, and upheld their beliefs, and they built a city. By 1850, with more than 116,000 people, it was the 5th largest city in the United States. And as they looked toward the second half of the 19th century, they could see New Orleans was, as that priest predicted, indeed on the verge of becoming a metropolis.
Catholics in the Crescent City, the First 300 Years is presented by the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation and the Willwoods Community. Additional underwriting support provided by the Archdiocese of New Orleans and First Bank and Trust.